Hey everyone, welcome to a new video, welcome to my channel. My name is Micah. Today I want to do my May wrap-up for you. In the month of May, I read 6 different books. I seem to be reading like one book more every single month. Yay! So I'm currently ahead of schedule for my Goodreads goal, which I'm super happy about. It usually happens that at the start of the year I tend to be ahead, and then towards the end of the year I always fall behind. We'll see how it goes in the second half of the year. And of the 6 books that I've read, I read 4 physical copies, and I read 2 books on audio, so let's start there. So the first audiobook that I completed all the way at the start of May is Neil deGrasse Tyson's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. And this was a book that I wanted to read because science isn't a topic that I read a lot in that area at all. I'm not a sciencey person, I am much more of like a language person. So for me, it was definitely sort of like a step out of my comfort zone, and I really enjoyed the listening experience. I do have to say that since I tend to listen to audiobooks to help me fall asleep or when I'm doing chores, I definitely could have perhaps paid a bit more attention to this book and understood it even better, because there were, especially towards the second half, like last third, I would say, of the book, where things got a bit more modern day and more like quantum physics kind of related, where I was like, okay, this is going a little over my head. But I have to say, like, the first 2/3 of the book were very easy to understand, and I felt the author was really able to break down astrophysics as a topic. So this is a book that's about neutrons and molecules and the Big Bang and supernovas and Einstein's theory of relativity, like all of these like big ideas. And I always find it very intriguing, but because science has never really been my strong point, you could say, I just don't really always understand it. And I really enjoyed how Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was also the narrator of the book, by the way, was really able to take me along for the ride. It's much more like a story than these are the facts kind of thing. And one thing I really took away from this book is Einstein's theory of relativity and why that was such a brilliant thing. I mean, we've all heard of Einstein, right? And we've all heard of his theory of relativity, but apparently what I really thought was cool is that he was able to devise this in his head way, like decades before anyone was able to actually verify his theory, and then he even turned out to be right. I mean, I just, and the book is filled with these kind of tidbits of people like, well, maybe it works like this, and then people had to prove it in experiments, and sometimes it didn't happen until like decades or hundreds of years later. So I always like the historical element to it, I always really enjoy. But yeah, this was one that I really did like, and it's a really short one too. So where some audiobooks can be like 15+ hours, this one is only like 3.5. Audiobook number 2 that I completed is by Judith Flanders, and it's The Invitation of Murder. And this is a non-fiction book by a historian, so much more up my street, and it's about crime in the Victorian era, which if you know anything about my reading tastes, we'll get around to it in a minute, but if you know anything about my reading tastes, I love Victorian England combined with like detective crime stuff. And this book, I wasn't really sure what to expect because it doesn't have really good reviews on Goodreads. A lot of people thought it was very tedious, so maybe it's a good thing I listened to it instead. But this is a book that takes true, like, murders and crime aspects, like brutal crimes that happened like the late 18th until the late 19th century, and sort of explains what happened, the facts that we can still trace today, but then it also talks about how that event sort of influenced public opinion, so how newspapers reacted to it and how it was portrayed by the press and what the public response was like, and how that also influenced, for instance, the trial that someone had to go through. And then it also goes one step further and it explains how all of that then again influenced literary works. And especially that last bit, I mean, some people were saying it was a bit too much of the same thing, but I can see that, you know, at the end of it I was like, yeah, now I kind of get it. But I wasn't aware of the fact how much Dickens actually didn't make up. Let's just put it that way. Like, he And also Arthur Conan Doyle. Like, the reason we have Sherlock Holmes is because Victorians were obsessed with these crimes and these trials and how the media responded to it. And then authors started to implement these true crime elements in their stories. And what we now think of as literature often very often started as penny dreadfuls or penny bloods. These like very like cheapy installments that everybody could buy. Which were seen as not the height of literature, but then these elements were adopted, and that's what we now call detective novels. I mean, I thought that was really, really cool. So it's not just history of crime, it's not just history of forensics as well, because it focuses on that as well, how forensic evidence improved and how science improved and sort of then steered the way trials were done. But yeah, it was a really, really interesting one. The narrator had a very pleasant voice. I have to say, I listened a lot to this going to bed. So I would go to bed like an hour earlier than I usually do, just to be able to listen to this book. And when you're able to do that for me, then I know it's a good one. So yeah, this was everything I had hoped for. It has crime, which some of them are really, really gruesome. Like, if you faint at the thought of blood, don't listen to this because it can be brutal. And then sort of the entire process of the person being arrested to them being put on trial is being discussed, as well as sometimes their execution, if that was what happened next. And then sort of how everything was picked up by the media and then literature later on. So I really, really thought it was very well done. And it very much played into like the hysteria of the time and how that sort of also influenced not only literature, but also what it meant for future generations as well. So a lot of what we do nowadays can all be traced back to things that were going on in the Victorian era. So this is one I truly, truly enjoyed. Moving into the physical books then, and if you saw my reading vlog in May, then you know I was reading this, Sally Rooney's Normal People. And I finished it during that vlog, so you may already know a little bit about my thoughts. The first half of this book was tedious. Very, very tedious, because we focus on two individuals and we follow them as they are teenagers in the first half of the book. And it's sort of just like this very confusing teenage romance kind of thing where you're like, you know, everything's awkward and, you know, that whole situation. I think it does that very well, but I just thought it was tedious. It was difficult to get through, and I couldn't really connect with the characters because of that sort of very teenage mindset that they're in. So that's why I also thought it was very frustrating at the time as I was reading this, because I was like, just say it already, apologize to her, you know, or you apologize to him, and nothing would have been an issue. But hey, they're teenagers, they're not going to do that, of course. And then the second half of this book, I read in one go. Not because it was that good, but because it was that dark and strange. I mean, this is not a book that I would recommend to everyone, because it's definitely a weird one. It's definitely not for everyone, but in the second half of this book, definitely trigger warning here for abuse and rape and all those kind of things, depression, mental health, because I then also got what that first half of the book, what it was trying to do, because it already plants the seeds for the things that are going to be happening later in the book. And this, it's not my favorite book of all time, but this is just one of those books that makes you think. It's just one of those. And I think that that's what literary fiction always aims to do, is to try and get you to think. And I think that that is a book, this book does that very well. So it's not my favorite, especially because it gets really dark and, well, quite graphic at times too. So it's definitely one that starts as a lovey-dovey teenage romance, but that's very awkward at the same time. And then the second half of the book, it's a painful story to read sometimes. So it is good, but it does come with a huge, huge warning sign, according to me. I also read some like fantasy kind of bits and like fluffy things. After such a serious book, I was definitely in for something more light. So I read this. The Darker Arts by Oscar de Muriel. This is part 5 in the Frey and McGray series, which is one of my favorite all-time series that nobody talks about. I already mentioned I love Victorian crime detective novels. This is a Victorian crime detective novel. In this story, we meet Nine Nails McGray, who lost his fingers, one of his finger, when his sister went crazy and chopped it off with an axe. And he is being helped by Ian Frey, who moves up to Edinburgh, because this is set in Edinburgh, to help him out, and together they run this paranormal department of the Edinburgh Police Department. And all of these books start with something mysterious, usually a murder or a disappearance or something, and then it's always solved along some of the scientific discoveries of the day, which I always like. This one starts with a seance. Seances were a really big thing in the 19th century, and everybody at the table dies apart from the gypsy who runs the seance. So of course she's immediately the suspect, but she also happens to be a friend of Nine Nails McGray. So the two, of course, want to help her and try and figure out what's actually going on, because nobody really knows whether she's telling the truth or what's going on exactly. So, and then of course we get the backstory of all of the people who were at that table. And let me say that that family, they're a bit of a nutcase situation as well. So this was a very enjoyable read, definitely one that I highly recommend. Because this has a really good like friendship kind of element as well, so I always like that. They have great banter, Frey and McGray, love it. And yeah, you can definitely see the character development as well in these stories now that we're on to book 5. So this is one of my favorite series, and I read the next installment. And then I read The Mortal Word by Genevieve Cogman. We're sticking to favorite book series that I read the next book of for a minute. This is also a 5th book in a series. This is the Invisible Library series by Genevieve Cogman. And in the first book, we meet Irene, who is a librarian for the Invisible Library. And in this world, the Invisible Library is an organization that tries to maintain order by stealing books from alternate universes. Really cool. The concept is just amazing with this one. And Irene needs to go to these alternate universes to steal these books, and then of course things happen along the way. In the first book we have a steampunk kind of Victorian England. In this one we get sort of like a 19th century Paris. They were very similar. I felt that the two worlds in the first one and this one were very similar, but one of the books is also set in like 16th century Venice and things like that. But this is around a peace talk kind of situation between the dragons and the elves, because those are the two disrupting powers, you could say. Dragons make things too orderly and Fae make it too chaotic. So there always needs to be a balance in the worlds, or else humanity will suffer, and they are now at odds. So there's a peace conference, and this peace conference has been disrupted because a murder happened. One of the delegates has been murdered. So Irene is sent to this world together with her friend, who is a detective in her 19th century London version, and then they try to solve the murder while not going crazy. So this was very enjoyable, fast-paced read. That's what these usually are. And yeah, it was just, Irene has sass. The woman doesn't get a break though. I do have to say how she gets through a day, I have no clue. That's a little bit unrealistic, but hey, it's a fantasy story with lots of action, so what's not to love? And last but not least, the last book I read in May is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This book series is one that is on my list to read for 2020, and I thought I would get started on it. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, Fae-oriented, and we meet Feyre. Feyre, that's how she's called. And she is in the woods trying to provide for her family, because her family had this downfall where they were pretty well off at first, but then her dad made a miscalculation in a business deal and they lost everything they had. So in order to not starve in the wintertime, she needs to go into the woods to try and find food. And as she's trying to hunt down a deer, a wolf is trying to do the same thing. And she kills that wolf in order to make sure she can provide for her family. And with that, she breaks a treaty, because that wolf wasn't an ordinary wolf. it was a fairy from across the border, so she's being kidnapped across the border to try and atone for her wrongdoing, and after that everything starts to catapult. This was another book where I felt the first half was very slow. Like, nothing happens. It's just about trying to get the romance going that I wasn't feeling at all. Like, I don't like a lot of romance to begin with, but this was kind of insta-lovey. I didn't get it at all. I didn't get it at all. My favorite character in the books is definitely Lucien. That's my favorite. He's witty. He doesn't just take Farah for granted, and he kind of like pushes her into dangerous situations as well. So that's what gets a little bit of the edge going in the first half of the story. In the second half of the story, it was like it was a completely different book, because that's where the action happens. So I would say first half romance novel, second half let's try and kick ass. So I like the second half so much more. I'm not sure whether I really am feeling the series as a whole yet. Of course, I still have 2 books to go. I've heard everybody saying that the second book is a lot better than the first one, but I feel that the Beauty and the Beast retelling has sort of been completed in this first one already. So I currently have no clue what's gonna happen in this second story. I have no, like, there's nothing there at the end of this one. You could definitely just read this one and just be done with the rest of the series. Because so many people have been saying that the second book is so great, I will continue on at some point, but it's not a priority for me right now because I felt that this felt very much like a standalone. I enjoyed it, mainly because of the second half of the book, but I did find it quite tedious to get there. So there you have it, my 6 reads for the month of May. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video. Leave me a comment down below with the things you have been reading. I would love to know. I always get great recommendations from people, and then I always try to get my hands on them at some point. So stay tuned, because there may be a haul coming next week. Just saying, just saying. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe to my channel. I make 1 video a week on this channel and 3 a week over on my beauty channel. So if you'd like to check that out, feel free to do so. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you again next week. Bye!